Yeah, thanks so much actually for having me. As you already heard, my work is all about multimodal learning. And I guess by now everybody at least has heard about multimodal learning. Not sure how familiar you are with that. But technically, just as a very brief recap, so the first three slides to get into the topic. Multimodal learning is mainly kind of like foundation of all the breakthroughs you have seen that are somehow related to, for example, to vision and text, like CLIP, but also stable diffusion, lava, and many more. And some things you need to know about multimodal learning is that even we have now all those fancy kind of like frameworks. Interestingly, training of those models is mainly based on very simple pairwise data. This can be an image and a caption, or a video and subtitles, or video and sound. And then technically, we have two, how to say, master algorithms in the field. First is contrastive loss, and the second is autoregressive loss. And just to kind of like briefly cover those. Contrastive loss you might have heard from is probably most famous from the CLIP model that has been released by OpenAI. And the idea is you want to do some contrastive pre-training by having an image encoder and a text encoder, or technically video and audio, whatever you want. And now the idea is that if you have here pairs that are coming from the same source, like for example, a subtitle and a video, you want to model those two guys, encoders, to project the embedding very close to each other, versus when you have kind of like here two samples that are coming from different sources, then you want to maximize the distance between those two embeddings. And if that goes well, then best case, you have learned something that you can refer to as multimodal embedding space. And the idea is that with this embedding space, you can actually do a lot of cool stuff, because you can, for example, take a text and project the text into this embedding space. So technically it just becomes a vector. And now you can, for example, take a lot of videos, you can project them in the same embedding space, and you can do zero-shot retrieval by just figuring out, okay, given this text, which video is the closest? And if you have done everything correct, you might actually get a video that shows pretty much what you're describing here in the text. Now, the second good thing is, as most classes that we have in the field in image and video actually are semantically meaningful. This means you can also just take the action class and consider it a text, project it into your space, and do zero-shot classification. This is the basic idea of every CLIP model probably that has ever been trained. Now, since 23, so last 2-3 years, another kind of like master algorithm has been added to our tool set, and this is autoregressive loss. And the idea, and this is very much the idea of the recent vision language models that you see that follow this lava architecture. And in this case, life is a bit different in terms of you assume you have already a pre-trained vision encoder, like for example, a CLIP model. And then you need a second ingredient, actually a large language model, like for example, Vicuna, Llama 3, Quen, whatever you want. And now the idea is no longer that you are training kind of like this embedding space. Now the idea is that you just want to train a projection layer between the vision and the language model that is just taking the vision tokens and projecting them into the input space of the language model. And then the interesting thing is you need to actually train this in a two-stage way compared to CLIP, because first you want to train your projector and technically keep the vision encoder and the language model frozen. So just train this kind of like embedding learning first. And then in the second stage, you actually want to adapt the model, the language model a bit. So you train the projector and the language model, because then, and technically you can keep the vision encoder frozen or train it, that's up to you. But then the cool thing is you actually have vision language models that you can use, for example, for visual question answering tasks. And those are mainly kind of like the two algorithms you need to know. And with that, I'm happy to show you what you can actually do with models that are trained in this kind of like way. And I brought you three different topics. The first one is mainly about localization abilities. The second then looks a bit more into explainability for vision language transformer. And the third one is then actually showing you hopefully some funny applications of what you can do when you kind of like know how to handle those projections that I just showed you. Okay, with that, let's actually step into the localization abilities of the models that you just saw. And the interesting story is in the beginning, the answer is there are no localization abilities of, for example, clip models. So in a very simple world, when you, for example, would just take a pre-trained clip model, like trained with contrastive loss, the way I showed you, and you would, for example, instead of matching the class token of the VIT, just take all the patch tokens and compare how good they match a query like photo of an airplane. You will see it actually will be super bad. And you can actually check that. Very simple example, when you take, for example, Pascal VOC classes or Pascal Coco, and you just kind of like do this matching of patches and text embedding token, you will see you get super low results. And now the kind of like reasoning behind that makes sense was, yeah, because CLIP is always trained on this kind of like global loss. So matching the class token to the class token, there is not much supervision for the patch tokens in general. So why should that actually kind of like work? But there was always kind of like a feeling that vision language models like CLIP anyway have some localization information. And you can also kind of like check that, because when you just take the image tokens and you, for example, take a token from here, the airplane region, and you compare this token to all the other tokens, you see that technically the right tokens already start to light up. Or the same if you take kind of like tokens from the persons here on the tarmac, and you start comparing those tokens to all the other tokens in the image, you see actually the humans are lighting up pretty nicely. So the question was kind of like, okay, so technically the tokens are right. What's wrong? And it turns out the main thing that we have in CLIP is not so much that the tokens are bad at localization. It's more that they are actually not really aligned with the text embedding of the text of the transformer part here. So, and another nice example that you can actually play is that even when you start kind of like querying this, you will see that sometimes the object is actually very well highlighted, or let's say you can see the object outline. You will just see that, for example, this kind of like score that you get for the object doesn't fit the embedding of the class token. So the regions are coming across pretty nicely. The only thing that's wrong, obviously, is kind of like this alignment. And therefore, the question was, okay, how can we fix that? And the good news is some people had already kind of like very nice ideas how to fix that before us. And one of the recent or most recent papers before we started was actually a paper called Clip Surgery. And clip surgery does something very weird. So the idea is that you actually take your original transformer path, so just a regular transformer architecture, and you forward your tokens with skip connection, everything. But that beside this transformer path, you actually kind of like start an alternative path where you just take the same input tokens as your transformer block, but you just process them differently. And the interesting thing that they actually proposed was to kind of like have tokens undergoing something that they called value-value self-attention. So instead of key query self-attention, you just take here the value weight matrices. You take those and then you actually compute attention with those, and then you undergo a linear projection and actually you kick out the feed forward layer. And surprisingly, this worked super well, as you can see here, when you kind of like, for example, just prompt this with photo of a horse. This is what you get in terms of token activation for the surgery pathway, and this is what you get for the clip pathway. The interesting part was nobody, or let's say the paper didn't really provide an explanation why it worked. And therefore we were curious, and we actually kind of like went into a bit and looked at how this kind of like value attention influenced the token scores in general. And based on that, we actually proposed something like an improved architecture, which picks up on this idea, but replaces this value attention with actually something that we call self-attention block. And the reason for this is that, so some findings that happened on the way, first, where the community was actually pretty sure is that removing the feed-forward layer, so the layer norm and MLP here, actually helps a lot with respect to alignment. That is one part, but what we actually found is that this value attention that was proposed before in clip surgery, what this was actually doing is was something like a token clustering approach, meaning that when you just take kind of like the attention from, no matter if it's key, query, or value, if you just take the attention of one token and you kind of like multiply it by itself, technically what you have is some form of autocorrelation. And by that, you weight tokens that have a similar pattern, kind of like with a similar weight, you practically take a mean cluster. You do something like k-means clustering on those tokens. And based on that, or based on those two findings, we thought, okay, we need to do this a bit better. So the first thing we proposed is, okay, when we kind of like change the key query value attention here to no longer be key query, but for example, value, query, so on, then it's good to actually have a normalization because the self-attention layer was not made to deal with that. The second important thing is then actually, okay, if we do that, it shows that everything that comes from here actually has kind of like a certain temperature, or that those weights can actually even be adapted more by adjusting kind of like the normalized score that you get here, which we call projection temperature, and that this helps to kind of like normalize the whole process. And then as we are kind of like doing something like k-means clustering, it helps to iterate for some kind of like iterations over the whole thing. And then finally, obviously, you don't need only value attention. You can easily repeat this with query, and key attention. And practically, as we have all three kind of like weight matrices, the idea was, okay, if we have all three, let's not pick one, let's actually use all three and ensemble over them. And it shows that this is actually kind of like giving pretty cool numbers. But before I show you any numbers, just to show you kind of like what this really allows us. So the result is that we can actually use any clip architecture as it is. So no matter if your favorite is OpenAI clip or the open clip from Lion or MetaClip model. And without actually having to retrain something, you can just change the architecture to actually allow for localization of even fine-grained objects, like, for example, here the violin or the boxer. You can tell apart the fruit versus the tree, where tree here mainly refers to the branch. But you also pick kind of like fine-grained stuff like the logo here on top of the image or the ring on the finger. And the interesting thing that we found is that we are actually able to do this localization mainly because we are able to leverage the clip vocabulary. And for that, I have some numbers for you. So technically, just in terms of results, when we would kind of like consider the localization ability of the method that I showed you, GEM, that we proposed compared to clip surgery, mask clip, and all the other training-free methods, you will see that, for example, for VOC, you can argue, okay, there are much better methods. like OV-sec is actually very strong baseline. Sec-clip is a very strong baseline. PACL is always running a bit out of competition because no one was able to reproduce the numbers so far. So probably keep an eye on OV-sec and sec-clip as kind of like the poster boys of localization. So interestingly, you see for Pascal-Vogt, training-free methods are actually not able to outperform them. The interesting thing is that once your data sets get larger, so they start having more classes, for example, like Pascal context, then those training-free methods are actually getting competitive. And now the interesting thing is we tested on one more data set, which is called OpenImage V7. And this OpenImage V7 actually has 5,000 to 6,000 different classes. And because we are curious of how the others would actually do, we took kind of like the best performing models that are, for example, either trained on annotation or on image text matching, so that are not training free. And it turns out that those methods actually already kind of like perform significantly worse on a data set that has kind of like 5,000 classes compared to all the training-free methods that you have seen, like mask clip, clip surgery, but also especially kind of like our gem clip model. And the interesting lesson that we learned out of that is first that clip models are actually able to do localization. And second, while they might not beat kind of like training approaches for very simple data sets, the interesting thing is they definitely have a much richer vocabulary than methods that are specifically trained for localization. But obviously, we want to kind of like, no, sorry. One more slide that was actually very interesting. And before I come to things we want to do better, are failure cases. Because some other lesson that we learned from that was actually kind of like what goes wrong when we kind of like try the stuff. And to give you an idea is here we have an image from OpenImage V7 dataset. And the original prompt for this image was human body. And now you can actually see, okay, it got the human, but technically it also labeled everything else in the image. So we were wondering, okay, what went wrong here? And you might guess that the interesting, how to say, finding that we had here is that those prompts, the way Clip understands them, is actually in an additive way. So what Clip actually labeled here when we prompted it for human body was first actually the body of the real human, but also the vehicle body or car body, because car engine are usually also referred to as car body. And therefore, we got both here. And technically, once you see this pattern, you cannot stop unseeing it because we found kind of like more prompts where we had kind of like those failure cases, like, for example, vehicle registration plate. And now you can guess what's wrong here. We wanted to get the registration plate, but because someone said, okay, vehicle registration plate, we actually got the vehicle and the registration plate. So what we learned from that is, okay, prompts are always kind of like additive, and we need to be careful how to prompt. And with that, we kind of like try to make it better. And this is now a paper that will appear at CVPR in 2-3 weeks from now. And this is kind of like trying to take this idea and see, does this also work with actions and video? And this sounds first a bit straightforward, but it's actually kind of like a bit related to the problem that I told you, because actions, the way we have them in data sets, are usually labeled as verbs and objects. Like, for example, pour milk, whisk egg, change tire, or saw wood. So it's always kind of like those verb-object complexes. And there's actually a kind of like a second, and technically for that, we know we can just decompose the prompt. And this is actually what we kind of like did in this paper. So when we had an action, we said, okay, if we want to find an action like whisk egg, then we need to decompose the prompt first in a photo of a person whisking or whisking something. And then second in object prompt, photo of a person using X. And then actually we also kind of like added the action prompt as the kind of like combination of both of them. And you see for each of those three prompts, you will get kind of like different heat maps, and the maximum heat or the maximum score will always be in some kind of like slightly different, how to say, position. And therefore, to actually kind of like combine them, we decided, okay, we need a weighted average over all those prompts. And it turns out that this weighted average usually corresponds very well to what human annotators would give you if you would ask them to label this action. Now, for the overall pipeline, there is a second problem. And the second problem is we're actually very good in labeling the objects, as you have seen before, like the violin or the ring or the logo. Where this whole kind of like clip pipeline is struggling a bit more is for actions, because actions like whisking or pouring are abstract. This means they don't have a shape. Like they don't have a set of tokens that look similar. They are just kind of like usually a very let's say, unbounded high-level representation of something. And therefore, one thing we figured is that in this clip pipeline that you saw, those kind of like highly abstract concepts, they arise actually very late in the pipeline. So one of the findings was that while objects with kind of like nice outline are usually established, let's say 50% in the VIT backbone, actions as concepts actually arise much later, which makes sense because of their high level kind of like abstractionness. And therefore, the second thing that we actually did for this paper was to say, okay, if we have those three different prompts, maybe we should not prompt them all the same. Maybe, for example, for objects, we should kind of like, we can start a bit earlier in starting to accumulating those, versus for actions, we should, for example, give the last layers in this whole kind of like pipeline a tiny bit more weight. And this is actually the final model that turns out best, where we decide, okay, we need some static weights for each kind of like prompt type. And then we decided to also add some dynamic weights based on the token prompt scoring. And everything together then actually made the final architecture. And it shows that this kind of like, especially this layer weighting, you can see varies also a bit across the different data sets that we have. So just to explain here a bit, we tested this approach on 4 data sets. One is Vehico, then Daily, then YouCook2, and Grounding YouTube. And the first 2 data sets are actually very object-centric. So they are mainly, how to say, actions of daily living, like, I don't know, what would be cleaning window would be a good example. Or let's say very object-centric. And you can see for those object-centric data sets, just having static weights is already kind of like doing a very good job, versus the later 2 data sets are actually very action-centric. So there, the action is kind of like in the focus, like the pouring oil or whisking or cutting or and so on and so on. And for those, you need this combination of kind of like static and dynamic weights to get kind of like optimal numbers. And what we also thought, so it can be a bit prompt dependent, but currently the data set bias is still outperforming pretty much everything in this area. Okay, and with that, we had our final system together. It's currently a bit challenging to compare it to other works because there is not really training free grounding in audio video or in action video models in general. So technically what we did is the upper 2 blocks that you see. So the first block are the best kind of like models that use some grounding training, including bounding boxes. The second block are models that are trained to do localization, but without bounding box information. And then in the lower part, you have all the training-free models, which is mainly the original GEM that we compare to the extension that we propose. And the interesting thing you see is that those training-free methods, in most cases, are not only able to actually beat the models that are pre-trained for localization, they're actually even also beating models like GLIB, which is explicitly trained with bounding boxes. And overall, you see on average, just by using the vanilla gem, you might not actually kind of like get state-of-the-art performance. But when you actually kind of like have those extensions, which is mainly the prompt decomposition and the layer weighting, then you actually have pretty good results on all those data sets. Okay, so just to wrap up, some lessons learned from that. So you saw first, I hope I can convince you glib is good at localization. And keep always in mind when you kind of like deal with vision outputs, tokens of the same object are mostly similar, especially in the last layers. And if you kind of like have those two recipes, then you can actually do a lot of nice stuff with those vision language models in terms of doing localization, even for complex expression, and so on and so on and so on. Okay, so that was the first bigger block. Now the two a bit tinier or a bit smaller ones. Second, I want to walk you a bit through explainability. And the idea here is that once you have a vision language model and a textual prompt, you actually want to generate a heat map. So it looks similar to the localization. The only thing is that the heat map is now not showing scores of just matching class tokens to local tokens. It's a heat map indicating the part of the image that's most sensitive to this prompt. And to actually kind of like get that, or let's say explainability in Transformer is still a bit of a challenging topic. And the method we propose in this case is a layer-wise explainability gradient, which means we say, okay, instead of computing one explainability map based on the last layer, let's actually compute an explainability map that shows what each layer contributes to this kind of like signal. And to do that, we actually use the gradient with respect to the VIT attention as a signal. And then we just pool over many layers and add a bit of ReLU to clip negative values, but this is really just a hack that gives kind of like 1% plus. This is not really killing it. But the reason why we actually did it, and let me actually switch to the next slide, is we had one interesting problem with the clip or with the GEM clip localization paper, and that was that those works that you saw, they actually worked all very well for VITB16, but they were never able to really upscale. And this is actually why we kind of like came along with this explainability method, because it didn't make sense. So why GEM for VIT16 would actually be better than for VITH? But what we were actually able to figure out with kind of like this explainability method is more how this vision language alignment actually happens over different layers in architectures. And one thing you might actually notice when you kind of like compare this explainability map is for VITB, you see a lot of explainability, like for example, when you have this, an image of a cat as a prompt, a lot of the explainability load is actually on the last layer. Versus for higher level architectures, you see that this kind of like explainability, so this vision language alignment actually happens somewhere in the higher layers, but it's not necessarily that the last layer in the network has the best kind of like alignment between vision and text. And now, if you just want to optimize your explainability, you can just kind of like pool over everything. But the most important kind of like information for us was, okay, this is probably why, for example, those vision or those kind of like GEM training free models that rely heavily on the last layer don't work so well, and why it actually makes sense to kind of like consider this vision alignment in larger architectures as a more complex problem. And just because we started it and we were curious, we thought, okay, once we have this kind of like layer-wise explainability for vision for clip models, can we probably also extend it to language models, so the autoregressive ones like Lava that you saw. And this is something that's currently kind of like in the making. And just to give you a kind of like a very short glimpse onto if it works, how it works, and so on. We tried to make it work for autoregressive models, and the answer is yes, it works, but it's actually a bit tricky. And the interesting problem that we have for autoregressive models in terms of making explainability methods works is that if you just do clip explainability, your life is easy. You have a prompt and you have an image, and you just need to compute the score for those two kind of like inputs. Now, for autoregressive models, obviously, you are producing a kind of like sequence of tokens once you generate the output. And now you can guess some of the tokens that your autoregressive model is actually producing are actually based on kind of like generating a real answer for the question, versus some tokens are actually just fillers, like stop words to make it sound like nice language. And obviously, if you, for example, compute the gradient of a filler word like and, it's going to kind of like give you a lot of, it's going to give you first not too much signal, but the signal is technically spread all over your image because there is no grounding in the image of this and token. And therefore, it turns out one of the most important things is you actually have to first find out this per token weighting score. So you have to figure out for each token that you generate, how much of the token kind of like score is actually grounded in the image, or how much attention is grounded in the image versus how much is actually in the prompt or in the previous generated text. And once you have that, then you can actually use the score to filter heads and words for, okay, which of those tokens is now really coming from the image and which is just based on some kind of like language statistics. And once you can filter out that, you can actually kind of like ground only the relevant ones, and then you actually get very nice attention maps. To actually evaluate that, we needed to stretch a bit, and we came up with a variation of Pascal VOC QA, where we just generated target answers for Pascal annotations and labeled the respective objects, so we can know technically the ground truth annotation for some of the tokens that are deemed relevant. And with that, we were able to start calculating things like IOU and so on. Okay, so that was a very short excursus towards the explainability part. And the reason why we took this kind of like small detour was first to give you an understanding that technically large architectures, especially large vision architectures, do not necessarily behave the same. So especially when you have localization methods that work very nice for VITB16, so for small architectures, and that actually show worse results for larger architectures like VITL and H, keep in mind it could be because they are relying too much on the last layer attention, and that technically the vision language alignment for large architectures happens throughout, let's say, usually the last 10, 20 layers of an architecture. So practically we found language alignment usually starts at 50% of your architecture and then usually refines in the last 25%. And then also keep in mind different models, like for example, OpenAI, Clip, Meta, Lion, MetaClip can actually show very different behavior. And we have some nice plots where we show how different models react to different classes, for example. So keep in mind, not every model actually has the same footprint with respect to this alignment. Okay. So that was a very short detour to explainability. Now, actually, the cool things that you can do with those models. And for that, I brought you a paper that is called Mask Inversion that's currently available on arXiv, that's taking all those ideas and playing around with them in a very interesting way. And the idea that this paper started with is assume you actually have an image, like for example this one, and you are given a mask for a certain object, like for example for this versus that animal. And now you want something like a representation only for the area under the mask, like a representation for exactly this region. How would you do that? And the naive version could be, okay, you can, for example, draw a bounding box around your mask and treat the bounding box as an image and use the image, get your clip embedding, and, for example, then do classification based on this mask. And then you can do this for the second mask and so on. And now the reasoning was, okay, can we probably do that a bit better? And probably before I go into the how, let me explain you actually why those region representations could be a good idea. The first, you already kind of like get a feeling if you, for example, have an image with two animals, maybe you don't want to have a class label for the full image, but probably you have here a cat and a dog, or you technically just have two different animals and you want to know the name of two different animals. In this case, obviously, you cannot just pass the full image to your vision encoder. In this case, you actually need to get a representation for each animal separately. And then you can ask a classifier, and it might give you kind of like alpaca versus llama. Another nice scenario why you might actually want localized region representations is given that you want to have a caption, but you don't want a caption for a full image like here. But for example, you just want a caption for the people in the image, or you just want to caption here the background, so the trees in the back. In this case, obviously, you cannot just give the full image to your language model. You actually need to give to your language model only something that represents this region. And finally, and this is probably the cutest example, imagine you have an image of your favorite dog somewhere. And you just want to kind of like take your dog and say, okay, I want an image of that dog on a snowy mountain. Then obviously also it makes sense to kind of like have a representation for the dog only and not for the rest of the image. Okay, and this is technically what this paper is all about. So how are we actually learning, or how do we actually get a good regional representation? And this idea is a bit wild, but you will see how all the stuff that I told you so far is coming together. So the idea is we want to have a token that represents a region that we want to specify by a mask, for example. So by giving, for example, drawing a mask around our dog. And obviously we want to do that at test time. Now, the idea is that we want to learn this token in a way so that the explainability map of this token actually covers exactly the region that we have given. Sounds a bit complicated, but it's actually a very straightforward idea. You start with your average clip encoder, meaning you take the division backbone of clip, you give it an image, you generate a class token. Now, actually, the query mask comes in, and what we now do is we just freeze everything except this learnable embedding token that's actually initialized with the weights of the class, with the parameters or floats of the class token. But technically, what we now do is we just take this token, match it, so compute the score with respect to the class token, and get the explainability map of this token. And now in the beginning, obviously, this is all over the place because it's just kind of like the explainability map of the class token. But what we now actually want is we now want to change the parameters in this embedding token in a way so that the explainability map of exactly this token actually maps as good as possible to our query mask. So technically what we are doing is we are optimizing the floats in this token with respect to the dice loss. So technically just the region matching loss of the explainability map of our token with respect to the query map. And the closer we get, the idea is the closer we get those explainability maps to match the query, the better this token actually represents this region. And so training-wise, it's actually very simple, very straightforward. The interesting thing is what you can actually do with that. And obviously, first thing we tried was region classification because this is the most vanilla task in this area. And we compared to kind of like red circle, alpha clip, and simple versions like cropping, mask crop, and so on. And you can see first that good news is we are pretty strongly outperforming everything else. But what's even cooler, or what's even better for us, or was the more impressive thing, is that this kind of like region representation now really scales even with kind of like the size of the model compared to others who are still relying on the simple matching. The second experiment that was quite interesting in this kind of like regards is obviously nobody likes to draw pixel-wise masks. So in terms of practicality, we also tested some other stuff. Like for example, how good are we when we just kind of like give it a bounding box, which kind of like dropped accuracy by 2%, but not too much. But what was really interesting when we just have a bounding box and a SAM kind of like region segmentation within this bounding box, then it turns out we can get even higher accuracy than just by hand drawn masks. And then we also tested a bit if we are kind of like robust against erosion and dilation. And it turns out having a bit more dilation, so having a bit more, actually usually is pretty robust. Having a bit less, not so good. But bounding box and SAM actually turned out to be the best solution for this kind of like representation. Second, obviously, we also tested localized captioning. And here it's probably a bit hard to see. So same image. Here we mainly masked the flowers. And as a result, we get a vase of flowers on a table. And here actually the mask is on the chairs in the background. And the respective caption that we get from that is indeed a chair with a bunch of chairs around it. So it's completely ignoring kind of like the flowers in the middle in this case. It also works for more complex scenes, but there you will see it also confuses a bit more. Here the mask is on the second, or on this woman here. And the result is really a woman sitting on a chair next to a woman with green umbrella. So based on the kind of like explainability maps that we get here, it's either considering this, it's definitely considering this the woman next to this woman, and maybe it's understanding this as a green umbrella, not sure. And if we put a mask here on the fruits, it's really a boat with a basket on the back of it. So you see kind of like how it interprets the scenes in this context. And finally, obviously, we wanted to explore the localized image generation. So here the dog, if you just kind of like mask the dog and want a picture of this dog, this is what you get. Same here with cats and also cheetah versus dog. But you can also do this if you, for example, here just want an image of the screen without kind of like the surroundings. So here the mask is really on the kind of like screen. You get exactly that. Versus when we mask only the keyboard, then the image is a keyboard and it's actually even overdoing the keyboard a bit. Or same with apples, generating apples, orange, generating orange, and so on, so on, so on. Okay, and then just again as a very final outlook, again, paper that's not yet published. Obviously, we also thought, okay, if we have kind of like nice representation, can we also use this as lava input? And the idea was, okay, let's just compute the masks by using DETR and SAM in combination because it's pretty straightforward. Let's compute representation, strain lava model, we are done. Actually turned out didn't work so well. So practically the answer is we had to do a lot of tweaking and everything. The main thing is if you just kind of like run the mask conversion tokens as is, they are not strong enough in terms of expressiveness. So what really helped is we needed to pool the regular vision tokens and combine everything with CLS and mask tokens. And when we combine them all, kind of like fancy architecture, but in the end, it's just kind of like different streams producing different tokens. And then actually it turns out we get very strong results with respect to compression, because then with, for example, masked lava, we can compress a lava which before had a visual input of 576 tokens to 42 tokens. And you see for some data sets, like especially Pope, Bench, Science QA, VisVis, we are not even losing a lot of performance. In some cases, we even improve because for some reason it seems to be a bit sharper signal. So again, this is just an outlook to what's possible. And just to summarize the lessons learned and to come to a conclusion, so we still have a bit time for questions and discussion. One thing we learned from this exercise is, for whatever reason, pooling is surprisingly effective for vision language models. So even when we would only pool, we would already have pretty good numbers. And the second thing we learned is that, for example, that the mask tokens that we have are actually very robust to test time token reduction. So technically, the model doesn't care if it was trained with 100 masks and then we reduce it to kind of like 15 or 10, or if it was trained with 50 masks, numbers actually numbers stay very robust and pretty much the same. So this was actually a very nice thing, because even for the state-of-the-art table that you saw, we just had to train one model, and then we could use it for all the evaluation without ever retraining. So we just trained this 101 masked model and we are done, and we could compress whatever we want. So this was actually a very nice finding, that we have a very robust representation here. And therefore, just to summarize that one, so probably one interesting thought about it is embeddings can be more than just CLS or patch tokens. As you saw, pooling is definitely great. And for this project, what I learned, sometimes projects are just fun, because this was a pure fun idea with no practical value whatsoever when it started. And it turned out to actually produce some very interesting insights about kind of like nature of tokens and everything. Okay, with that, I'm happy to conclude. Some future directions that we are currently considering, and that I also try to put in kind of like questions for everybody, is first the problem of data. So when we train those vision language models, technically, as I told you in the beginning, we have this pairwise data. But this pairwise data is actually just kind of like the tip of the pyramid of data that we are sitting on, because there is a huge body of data that doesn't appear kind of like with pairs modalities. And the question is, are we currently missing out by just kind of like not using this kind of like single unpaired data for training? Second question that we have, and this is specifically for robotics, what is the role of synthetic data in this whole game? I know robotics trains a lot with synthetic data. Is this actually kind of like the solution, or just a slippery slope towards kind of like convergence to the mean? And then finally, and this is more specific for kind of like my interests, can we actually extend this to long-range data? So in this case, I'm more thinking about those pairs that we are using. One image, one kind of like caption is very limited in terms of information. And there's a huge body of information usually around those samples that we grab from the internet. What would we actually need to kind of like make leverage of all the kind of like data that surrounds them? Do we need different training techniques? Do we need different benchmarks? And with those questions, I'm actually happy to open the discussion, and hopefully at some point we can actually get self-supervised multimodal learning to even do more than it can do at the moment. With that, I'm happy to thank all the PhDs who contributed to the works that you saw, all the collaborators that we have, and I thank you for listening, and I'm very much looking forward to the discussion.
Thanks a lot, Hilda. Thanks a lot for the excellent talk. I think we learned really a lot. So yeah, if anyone have questions, feel free to just unmute yourself and start asking. And I could get it started. Yeah, so in the action grounding work, I found that's really a cool idea. But you mentioned that like the soda approach are pretty much dominant by the data bias. What exactly was it? What do you mean with that?
Yeah, so first problem that comes with action grounding is that getting ground truth data, even just for evaluation, is very hard because you need humans to annotate bounding boxes in multiple frames over time. And then even the video community didn't agree on what we actually want to label there. So if the bounding box that we ask annotators should actually comprise, for example, the hand and the object, which can already kind of like be the whole kind of like video, or if it just should just be the center point, or if it should be, for example, the human and leave out the object completely. So there's currently a lot of inconsistencies even in the four evaluation data sets that I showed you. And as I said, for the first two, like Vehico and DALI, technically those annotators labeled mainly the object and extended only slightly towards the body. We have other data sets that we left out completely, which only label the human and leave out the object completely, which is not kind of like, yeah, you can solve that with a person detector. And then you cook too. Oh no, you cook instructions and grounding YouTube. Those are actually kind of like usually trying to grasp the interaction of body and object. So they really draw bounding boxes around those kind of like blocks. Sometimes better, sometimes worse, and you always have some corner cases. But yeah, so in this case, labeling ground truth is still is the real challenge, even before getting good grounding.
Yeah, get it. Thank you. Um, yeah, I have another two questions. Um, yeah, if somebody else have some questions, just feel free to jump in as well. So my second question is related actually to multimodal learning. You mentioned that there are a lot of like data out there which just have one modalities, and there are also a lot of like basically what I'm thinking was like, okay, we have image, we have video, we also have language, but there are more modalities as well, right? Like for instance, audio signal that's already quite commonly used, and then there might be if we have those egocentric parts, we might also have gaze locations and so on. So what do you think would be the best way? How do you see this problem in the sense that some data set has four, say, four modality, and some others have another different set of four, or maybe there is one or two like that the same or overlapping between two data sets. And what would be the like the roadmap to make use of this kind of data set?
I I have to say, I'm not sure if I can give you a definite answer down this road. There have been different ways to kind of like approach this problem. Like for example, ImageBind was a model that tried to integrate a lot of different modalities by binding everything around the image representation. Then obviously the second option is language bind, by tying everything to language and then using language as a bridge. And I think this is what currently is winning a bit the race. So you see a lot of approaches which just take a modality, translate it to text, like for example, image, generate a caption, and then use the caption to actually ask the visual question answer. And those work surprisingly well. So numbers are actually pretty good for those. But I think in general, it's an interesting question. And I think in terms of one of the future directions of multimodal foundation models in general, if we want to get to kind of like the next generation and integrating more modalities, this is exactly the question that we need to answer. How do we address this problem that paired data is actually very sparse and very rare, and single modality data can sometimes is more abundant, sometimes less, but definitely available much more than paired. And yeah, so I think if you have a good solution for that, you have a good solution for the next generation of multimodal foundation models.
Oh, thank you. Yeah. Um, My last question is a little bit just curiosity. Yeah, so for robotics, synthetic data actually is quite largely used because collecting real world data is just so difficult, as you said. Yeah, but what are the current thoughts regarding using synthetic data in computer vision tasks? Because some of the data, as you said, we have a lot of YouTube data, we have a lot of like internet data. Do we still need some synthetic data in computer vision tasks? And if yes, where would be the most needed place?
Yes, so again, not sure if this is really kind of like the solution to everything, but one area where we actually see synthetic data coming in more and more is exactly to generate this pairwise data to solve this data pyramid solution. Because as exactly what I said, when you have an image, nowadays you can easily generate a caption. And this is how you can generate data pairs even if they haven't been there before. But obviously, this is also kind of like the slippery slope because you're just reproducing the knowledge that was already built in some model. And therefore, the question is, are we really adding knowledge to the model by doing that? And this is exactly where synthetic data is super helpful, but also has some caveats and where I hope we can kind of like figure out more if this is a problem or if this is actually the solution here.
Yeah, yeah. Thank you. We have a question in the chat. Do you want me to read it or?
Yeah, probably go ahead for
Okay,
everybody.
yeah, so it's from Wilwen, and the question is, the message is, thanks for the great talk. Recent research from Meta shows that models purely are trained on vision data can also understand language, while exhibiting even better scalability. What do you think are the roles of vision data and language data for model pre-training?
Probably question, do you remember the title of the paper or the name of the model?
The
Ah, okay.
scalable and the language, yeah, very much.
Honestly, haven't seen that yet. There are so many papers coming out. I apologize. I have a crew of very good PhDs, but even we are not able to catch everything on archive at the moment. But let's say something that I have seen with other models before is that there is interestingly a lot of, how to say, cross-fertilization on different modalities. And the best example I have is the AST model that was built in Jim Glass Group at MIT, where they found that if you want a good speech model, you should actually initialize it with ImageNet weights. And then you can process spectrograms as images, and you can actually do very good speech recognition. And technically, I think there is still probably this is also an interesting direction that we should explore more just to see, okay, if stuff is initialized in one way, can we actually adapt it to something else? But yeah, so it makes a lot of sense. Probably something similar that came up in this sense. There was another paper called Vision as LoRa, which was able to train vision language models just by adding LoRa adapters and then feeding in raw images. So I think there's definitely a lot of potential to figure that out more. But thanks actually for the paper hint. I will definitely give it a read.
Oh, it's just related to the class organization. Yeah. So yeah, thanks, Hilde, for answering our questions, and also thanks them for the question.
Yeah, thanks so much for
Yeah.
having me. See you.
So yeah, have a nice evening.
Yeah,
Thanks
you
everyone.
too.
Bye bye.